barbell back squat is a key strength exercise for runners for a couple different reasons. Number one, it's very running specific. So the movement that you go through when you're doing a squat is very similar to your running stride. Obviously, when you're running, you do one leg at a time. When you're doing a general barbell back squat, you're doing both sides at the same time. However, the movement you go through, the flexion at the hip, the extension at the hip, and the movement at the knee is all very, very similar to your actual running stride. So when you're practicing the barbell back squat in the gym, it's a fantastic way to work on your power in your running stride, because what you're doing is you're able to work with a larger amount of weight than if you were to just go out for a run. And you're also able to work on it in a controlled environment. So you can go slow, you can practice the movement, and you can really get the finer points of the technique down. So let's take a look at how we do it. To safely do a back squat, it's a great idea to set up in a squat rack. So let's take a look at what we need to do to get everything ready to go. So the first thing you're gonna do is you're gonna need to set what height the bar is at. So most squat racks are gonna have a variety of holes down the side, and you're gonna be able to select how high you want that weight to be. Ideally, if you're going to the same gym or if you're using the same equipment all the time, either you can mark where that spot is, or the easiest thing to do as well is to just count down from the top or from the bottom the number of holes where you use it. And that way you're always going to be sure that you're setting up the bar in the same spot. The ideal height that you want that bar at is when you put the bar into the rack. If you're standing next to it, you want that bar to rest just below your shoulder. So that way, when you go in, when you get set up, you can stand up just a tiny bit, lift that bar just enough to clear the hooks, and then you can step backwards and you're ready to go for that squat. The reverse process when you're re-racking the bar after your squat is the same. And so once you have it at that really nice, comfortable height, you don't need to do too much of a knee bend to get that weight started, but it's also gonna be in the right spot for when you finish. After you set the height of the bar, then you're gonna move on to setting the catcher bars. The catcher bars are the safety bars down at the bottom here. And they can go in a variety of different positions. I've got mine kind of at the lowest setting here, but ideally what you want here is if you were to fall or if you weren't be able to make it back up, that's gonna make sure that the bar doesn't fall all the way to the ground and land on top of you. So I've got it low enough that I know that I can kind of fall backwards out of this. The bar is gonna get caught by those catcher bars, and I'm gonna make sure that I'm nice and safe. If you're lifting heavy, you can also use a spotter behind you. That way if you get stuck at the bottom when you're starting to get fatigued at the end of a set, they can help lift you back up. The final thing for setup is to select what weight you're gonna be putting on the side. Once you put your weight on, one of the key things to do with a barbell back squat is you wanna use the barbell collars as well. What those do is they go on, they lock the weight in place, and that way if you were to wobble a little bit, you move maybe a little bit to one side, the weight isn't gonna slide off, which usually causes a big crash, could cause injury, and it's not a great thing to have. So once you put the collars on there, it's gonna stop the weights from moving around, and it's gonna make this a lot safer. Once you've got the height of your bar set, you've got your catcher bars in place, and you've got your collars on, you're ready to go. Although it's one of the fundamental strength exercises, the squat still has a lot of complexity to it. So it's one of those things where you're gonna slowly grow as an athlete, you're gonna get more comfortable with it, and you're gonna really find what works for you over time. The squat is very personal. Depending on how long your legs are, how wide your hips are, your setup is always gonna vary. It's gonna be a little bit different depending on how you're built. So there's a few modifications we'll talk about at the end here that will make sure that you're able to find what works for you. So we're gonna talk over the squat, starting at the feet, working our way up the body, to kind of talking about what's gonna happen at each joint, and just a few pointers to keep you on track. So the first thing we're gonna start with is the feet. When we're setting up our feet for a squat, we wanna have them at least hip width apart. If you have long legs, you might need to go a little bit wider than that. With those feet, we're gonna have them set up, and we wanna make sure that we have our toes just ever so slightly out. You don't want your feet straight forward, and you don't want them turned way, way, way to the outside. So just a little bit of a toe out, and we wanna make sure we have even weighting. And that even weighting is gonna sit evenly between our heels, the ball of our foot, and the outside of our foot. So if you kind of think about your foot like a tripod, you've got even weighting on all three of those major points. That's gonna make sure you're nice and stable and you're able to move really well when you get into that squat. Next up, we're gonna talk about the knee. And so when we're going down into that squat, we wanna make sure, I guess at the top, we wanna make sure that our knee isn't locked out. You never wanna have your knees locked with weight on. That's really not great for them. So you always wanna have at the very top of your movement, just a soft bend in your knees. From here, when you go down, you wanna bring your knee out over your toe. There's a pretty common misconception that you can't let your knee go over your toe when you're squatting. And that's not actually true. You wanna make sure that you do have that knee go out a little bit because that's gonna let you go down a little bit lower. But again, you always wanna start light, work your way up after you've figured out the form, and you're gonna know how far out that knee goes once you've done a little bit of practicing, you've done a little bit of trial and error. Once we move up past the knee, the next thing to consider is the hip and what our hip does. So when we're doing a squat, we want to come down and back, and we want to make sure that butt is getting way out behind us. So like I was talking about with the knee, when that butt goes back, that means our knee has to go forward in order for us to keep our center of gravity over top of our feet. So that butt is going to go back, and when we go down in that squat motion, we want to make sure that we're not going too low, that we start to have our hips tip at the very, very bottom. So what I'm talking about is when we go down in that squat, you want to maintain kind of a nice flat low back and even like a little bit of a curve to it. As we go down in that squat, you'll get lower, 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 and then you'll get to a point where if you want to go any lower, you basically see my low back kind of curve forward there. And so that kind of changes the angle of the spine, changes the loading through the spine, and that's not great for stability. So we want to just go to the point where that's about to happen, and then we head back up from that point. That's going to make sure that we're not loading the back incorrectly. Over time, you're going to get more comfortable going lower, and your goal should be to try and get as low as possible in that squat to just get the most range of motion and the most activation out of all those muscles. The final piece of the puzzle is our chest. And when we go down in that squat, we want to make sure that we keep our chest up and open. So I like to pick a spot on the wall in front of me that I'm going to look at, and I try to keep my head, my neck, and my chest facing straight towards that point. We really don't want to kind of hunch forwards or bend forwards while we have the weight on our back, because again, it's not going to be great for all of our vertebrae. So pick a spot on the wall, keep that chest and that head up nice and stable. So now let's put it all together, put some weight on, and see what this actually looks like in practice. So to set up on the bar, I'm going to find there's a couple different marks on the bars. I just find one of them that feels fairly comfortable, just a little wider than shoulder width. And then you can use that to make sure that you're centered. If you're off to one side, when you pick it up, you're gonna feel that weight wobble to one side. You can re-rack it and adjust if you need to. So for me, I'm right here in the middle. You can see when I'm at the bottom here, all I have to do is just a little bend with the knees. I've picked that weight up, and again, I don't wanna lock those knees. I can take a little step back, and I'm ready to go. So I'm gonna set my feet up, just a little bit wider than hip width apart. Toes are slightly out. And then from here, I'm going down into that squat, and I'm coming back up. The other thing you wanna make sure you're not doing is letting your knees collapse in. So you want those knees staying nice out over top of your feet and just going a little bit out in front of your toes. So that's my squat motion there. And for me, I have fairly long legs, so you can see I have a fairly wide stance. If you've got a little bit shorter legs, you might have a little bit narrower stance. But in a nutshell, that's how we want to do our squat. To adjust your difficulty, you're going to want to increase by 5 to 10 pounds on each side. So again, with the squat, because you've got weight on both sides, you need to just make sure when you do add weight, you're adding a little bit to each side. So if you add 5 pounds, it's going to be 10 pounds increase total. If you add 10 pounds, it's going to be a 20-pound increase. So if you're feeling like you're fairly comfortable with the weight that you are lifting, you could probably go up by a 10. If you're getting close to your limit, going up by 5 is going to be perfect. If you find that you're restricted in terms of how low you can go in your squat by the flexibility of your ankles, one thing you can do is you can add a little bit of a wedge underneath your heels. This is exactly what weightlifting shoes do. You've got a nice thick heel and a fairly thin forefoot. It puts you up on your toes a little bit more. What this does is when I'm squatting, if I can't get my knee out over top of my toes far enough, it's gonna limit how far down I'm able to go. So all you need to do is take something nice and solid. I like to just use some 5 or 10 pound weight plates. You're gonna set those up in the exact spot where you're gonna be squatting, and then all of a sudden you can put your heels up on that, your forefoot down on the ground, and you're gonna have a nice solid base to stand on, but you have that little bit of an elevated heel. When you're doing this, this isn't something you wanna do long term. Ideally what you would do is you'd be working on that lower leg flexibility, and you'd put the weight underneath, or you'd put the wedge underneath the heels, and over time you want to shoot for something thinner and thinner and thinner until eventually you're able to go without having anything underneath the heel. The next modification that you can do is you can use a band if you're finding that your knees collapse inwards. So when you're squatting, again, like I was saying, you don't want to have those knees collapse in because that gets into a very weak position and it puts a lot of force on the knees. So one thing you can do to remind yourself and kind of build up a bit of strength and encourage your knees to come outwards is use a little loop band like this, or you can take one of the longer TheraBands, tie it into a loop that's the right size. But essentially what you're gonna do here is you're gonna put it around just below your knees. You're gonna set yourself up, and then when you go into that squat, that band is gonna try and pull those knees inwards, and you're gonna work on resisting and pushing outwards. So when you get into that squat position, you're gonna go down, you're gonna let those knees come out, and then you're gonna come back up again. So that's one great way just to make sure that you're able to keep those muscles active, and you just have a bit of proprioceptive feedback, making sure that you're on the right track. The last modification that we'll talk about is if you find when that bar goes across your shoulders and across your neck, if you don't have a lot of muscle, you can sometimes feel that bar really pushing into the bone there, and it can be quite uncomfortable. So that's where a bar pad like this comes in. They come in a variety of shapes and sizes, but all it really is something nice and soft that slides onto that bar. Some of them have straps to kind of hook them on a little bit more securely. But what this does is it cushions that bar. This one has like a nice cutout, so it sits a little bit more kind of securely on your shoulders. And then when you get into position, you get that bar in place, and then when you stand up, it's a lot more comfortable because that bar is actually cushioned against your neck. If you don't have access to a squat rack like this, there are a few different alternatives that you can use. Number one, you can use a leg press or a Smith machine at a gym. Those ones are still going through that same range of motion, just like if you were squatting. The one downside to something like that is because you're not stabilizing that weight, the machine is guiding you through the range of motion. It works the major muscles, but it doesn't work those stabilizers quite as much as a barbell back squat does. The other thing you can do is you can use just a barbell on your back without the squat rack. The one thing here is it's a little bit harder to get in and out of that, and you can't lift quite as heavy of a weight, but it still does work great. And the final adaptation that you can do is you can use a set of dumbbells, and you can take one dumbbell, set it on each shoulder, hold them this way, and then you can do your squats that way. Same limitation in terms of not being able to lift quite as much weight. You're really limited to how much weight you can hold in one hand and how much you can kind of get up and get back down safely.